The Casey Anthony trial, a verdict that divided America. On June 16, 2008, a 2-year-old girl was last seen alive in Orlando, Florida. Her name was Caylee Anthony. No one outside her immediate family realized she was missing. Not that day, not the next. 31 days would pass before police were called. By then, the story had already fractured. The woman at the center of it was her mother, Casey Anthony. When officers first arrived, they were not responding to a report of a child's death. They were responding to a 911 call made by Casey's mother, Cindy Anthony. The call was urgent, distressed. She told dispatchers that her granddaughter had been missing for over a month. She also said something else, that Casey's car smelled like there had been a dead body inside. Those words marked the beginning, not just of an investigation, but of a case that would divide the country. When police questioned Casey Anthony that day, she did not admit that Caylee had been missing for 31 days. She did not describe panic. She did not describe search efforts. Instead, she told investigators that Caylee had been kidnapped by a nanny, a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. She claimed she had left her daughter with this nanny and that the nanny had disappeared with her. Detectives asked for contact information, an address, a phone number. Casey provided details. Investigators checked them. The nanny did not exist. The apartment she claimed to have visited had no record of her presence. Her employer, whom she told police she worked for at Universal Studios, confirmed she had not been employed there for years. Confronted with this, Casey did not immediately admit the lie. She led detectives around the Universal Studios campus, pretending to point out an office. Eventually, she stopped walking. She admitted she did not work there. That moment shifted the tone of the investigation. The lies were not small. They were layered, and they were deliberate. Meanwhile, search teams began looking for Caylee. Neighbors were interviewed. Surveillance footage was reviewed. Casey Anthony was arrested on charges related to providing false information. At that point, there was still no body, only a missing child and a mother whose stories changed repeatedly. The Anthony home became a focal point. Media vans lined the street. Reporters stood outside day and night. Inside, tension grew. Cindy and George Anthony, Caylee's grandparents, publicly pleaded for her safe return. They appeared on television. They defended their daughter. They insisted Caylee was alive. But private conversations told a more complicated story. Phone records revealed that during the 31 days Caylee was missing, Casey had not contacted police. She had attended parties, visited friends, gotten a tattoo reading Bella Vita, beautiful life. Those details fueled public outrage. How could a mother behave that way if her child was missing? Casey's defense team would later argue that behavior does not always align with trauma. But at the time, perception hardened quickly. On December 11, 2008, 6 months after Caylee was last seen, a utility worker discovered skeletal remains in a wooded area less than half a mile from the Anthony home. The remains were later identified as Caylee Anthony. The location was not remote. It was close. Close enough that searchers had previously passed near it. Close enough that familiarity became uncomfortable. The discovery transformed the case. No longer a missing person investigation. Now, a homicide. The discovery transformed the case. No longer a missing person investigation. Now, a homicide. Prosecutors charged Casey Anthony with first-degree murder. The state announced it would seek the death penalty. The theory presented early was direct, that Caylee had been intentionally killed, that chloroform had been used, that duct tape found near the remains indicated suffocation. The prosecution argued that Casey wanted freedom, freedom from motherhood, freedom from responsibility, freedom to pursue what they described as a lifestyle incompatible with raising a child. The defense prepared a different narrative, one that would surprise nearly everyone when presented in court. They argued that Caylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool, that George Anthony, Casey's father, had discovered the accident, that he had helped cover it up, and that Casey, conditioned by years of alleged dysfunction, followed instructions rather than call for help. This defense was not introduced immediately. It would emerge during opening statements at trial. For now, the focus remained on investigation. Forensic teams analyzed the trunk of Casey's car. A computer in the Anthony home showed searches for terms related to suffocation and chloroform, but the timeline of those searches became disputed. Experts disagreed on interpretation. The media coverage intensified. Commentators speculated nightly. Public opinion surveys suggested overwhelming belief in Casey's guilt. But trials are not decided by opinion. They are decided by evidence, and evidence would be tested in a courtroom for weeks. The case had already become more than a local tragedy. It had become a national debate about motherhood, deception, and motive. But beneath the spectacle remained something simpler. A 2-year-old child was dead, and no one had yet explained how. By the time formal charges were filed, investigators had constructed a theory built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness, no recorded confession, no direct forensic proof placing a weapon in Casey Anthony's hands. What the prosecution assembled instead was a structure of timelines, chemical analysis, digital traces, and behavior. Each piece alone was not conclusive. Together, they argued, it formed a clear pattern. One of the most heavily discussed pieces of evidence was the trunk of Casey Anthony's Pontiac Sunfire. When the car was recovered from a tow yard in July 2008, several employees reported a strong odor coming from inside. They described it as unmistakable, like decomposition. When investigators opened the trunk, they found garbage bags containing household waste. There was no body, but the odor remained a focus. Forensic experts testified that air samples taken from the trunk showed chemical compounds consistent with human decomposition. The defense countered that those compounds can also result from ordinary trash. They argued that garbage left in a hot Florida vehicle for days could produce similar smells. The debate over the trunk became one of the most technical aspects of the trial. Jurors were asked to consider chemical signatures, expert interpretation, and the limitations of odor analysis. Another significant point involved internet searches conducted on the Anthony family computer. Prosecutors introduced evidence that someone had searched for terms such as chloroform, neck breaking, and how to make chloroform. They argued that these searches occurred in the days before Caylee disappeared. The implication was clear: preparation, planning, intent. The defense challenged the timeline. They suggested that the searches were misinterpreted, that multiple people had access to the computer, that forensic software could not definitively establish who was at the keyboard at specific moments. The state also presented evidence of chloroform detected in the trunk. An FBI analyst testified that chloroform was found at levels consistent with decomposition enhanced by chemical presence. The defense called their own experts, who disputed both the methodology and the conclusion. They emphasized that chloroform can be produced naturally through household cleaning products and environmental factors. As each expert testified, the trial shifted from emotional narrative to scientific debate. Jurors were not only evaluating character, they were evaluating chemistry. Then there was the duct tape. Near Caylee remains, investigators found 3 pieces of duct tape. The prosecution argued that this indicated suffocation. The defense pointed out that the remains had been exposed to elements for months, that wildlife activity could have displaced items, that positioning could not definitively prove cause of death. Medical examiners faced a difficult task. The remains were skeletal. No soft tissue remained. The official cause of death was ruled homicide by undetermined means. That phrase would later become central. Undetermined means left room for doubt, and doubt is powerful in a courtroom. Behavioral analysis also entered the narrative. During the 31 days Caylee was missing, Casey Anthony had not reported her daughter missing. Instead, records showed she visited friends, went out socially,
and entered a hot body contest at a nightclub. Photographs were displayed in court, smiling, dancing, appearing untroubled. The prosecution framed this as consciousness of guilt. The defense argued that trauma manifests differently in different people, that outward behavior cannot reliably measure internal state. Testimony from friends described Casey as calm during that period, but they also described her as secretive. She told different people different stories, that Kaylee was with a nanny, that she was traveling, that she was fine. The repetition of false explanations weighed heavily in public perception, but the defense asked jurors to separate dislike from proof. They argued that lying does not equal murder. They suggested that Casey had been conditioned to lie as a coping mechanism. They introduced allegations of family dysfunction, of secrecy, of control. The trial grew more complex as both sides layered narrative over fact. Phone records were dissected minute by minute. Cell tower pings were mapped. The prosecution emphasized an 84-minute gap in Casey's phone activity on the day Kaylee was last seen. They suggested it aligned with a possible window of harm. The defense argued that absence of phone use proves nothing. As weeks progressed, the jury absorbed thousands of pages of testimony. Charts were projected, photos displayed, audio recordings replayed. One of the most dramatic moments occurred when prosecutors played Casey's jailhouse calls with her parents. In those conversations, she rarely asked about search efforts, rarely expressed urgency. Instead, discussions revolved around routine matters. To prosecutors, this demonstrated detachment. To the defense, it showed denial. The state's overarching claim was simple: that Casey Anthony deliberately killed her daughter to free herself from responsibility. The defense countered with an alternative explanation: that Kaylee accidentally drowned in the family pool, that panic and fear led to concealment, that George Anthony, as a former law enforcement officer, understood how to stage a scene. The drowning theory was introduced during opening statements. It stunned observers. There was no prior public indication of that argument, but introducing it early forced jurors to consider an alternative narrative from the outset. In a capital case, the burden rests entirely on the prosecution. They must eliminate reasonable doubt, not just propose a convincing story. By the time the defense began presenting its case in full, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. For weeks, jurors had listened to the state build a structure of suspicion: chemical traces, computer searches, behavioral inconsistencies, a mother who lied repeatedly. Now the defense stood and did something unexpected. They reframed the story entirely. In opening statements, defense attorney Jose Baz told the jury that Kaylee Anthony had drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool on June 16, 2008. He alleged that George Anthony, Casey's father and a former law enforcement officer, discovered the child's body. He claimed that George then orchestrated a cover-up. The courtroom fell silent as this theory was introduced. There had been no prior evidence of drowning presented by investigators. There was no autopsy confirming water inhalation. The remains had been too decomposed to determine cause of death. The prosecution objected repeatedly, but the strategy had already accomplished something critical. It created an alternative, and in a capital case, an alternative explanation does not need to be proven. It only needs to be possible.
The defense then began dismantling the state's forensic claims piece by piece. Regarding the trunk odor, they called experts who testified that human decomposition cannot be definitively identified by smell alone. They argued that scientific testing of volatile organic compounds was still evolving, that the prosecution had overstated certainty. On the computer searches, the defense presented evidence suggesting that multiple users accessed the household computer. They pointed out discrepancies in timestamp analysis. They questioned the reliability of browser history reconstruction. They emphasized that no fingerprint, no direct digital proof tied Casey specifically to the searches about chloroform. The state's chloroform theory also came under pressure. Defense experts testified that chloroform can be formed through reactions between household cleaning agents and organic material. They questioned whether the levels detected in the trunk were truly abnormal. Each technical challenge chipped away at the state's narrative. Then came George Anthony's testimony. He denied any involvement in Caylee's death. He denied discovering a drowned child. He denied staging anything. The defense cross-examined him intensely. They suggested inconsistencies in his recollection. They highlighted past statements. They introduced allegations of family dysfunction, including claims of inappropriate behavior in Casey's childhood. The prosecution objected to portions of this line of questioning, but the implication lingered. If the jury believed there was dysfunction, secrecy, or fear within the household, Casey's behavior might be interpreted differently. The state attempted to reassert focus. They reminded jurors that no evidence supported drowning. No water was found in the remains. No physical indication tied George to disposal. The duct tape, they argued, was not incidental, it was purposeful. Yet even here, the defense found room. They noted that the duct tape was not definitively proven to have been placed over Caylee's mouth while alive. They argued that environmental exposure and decomposition could have altered the scene. The trial became less about proving what happened and more about questioning whether the prosecution had proven what they claimed happened. As closing arguments approached, both sides sharpened their positions. The prosecution stood before the jury and summarized weeks of testimony. They emphasized motive, freedom, a lifestyle unencumbered by motherhood. They replayed the timeline of lies. They asked jurors to consider whether an innocent mother would fabricate a nanny, would mislead police, would spend 31 days without reporting a missing child. They described the duct tape as silent evidence. They described the trunk as temporary concealment. They asked for conviction on first-degree murder. The defense responded by focusing on burden. They reminded jurors that suspicion is not proof, that dislike is not evidence, that the cause of death was officially listed as undetermined. They repeated that no direct forensic evidence tied Casey to homicide. They told jurors that if even one piece of the state's case left reasonable doubt, their duty was clear. The deliberation phase began. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Media networks prepared verdict graphics in advance. Public opinion polls overwhelmingly suggested a guilty verdict. But juries deliberate in private, and they do so under a standard far narrower than public sentiment. When the verdict was announced on July 5, 2011, the courtroom remained still. Not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter. Guilty only on 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The reaction outside was immediate: shock, anger, disbelief. Commentators described it as one of the most controversial verdicts in modern American legal history. Inside the courtroom, Casey Anthony showed little visible reaction. The judge sentenced her to time served for the false statements. She would be released days later. For many observers, the verdict felt disconnected from expectation. But jurors later explained their reasoning in interviews. They said the prosecution had not eliminated reasonable doubt. They pointed to the lack of a definitive cause of death. They cited uncertainty around the duct tape. They described forensic evidence that felt suggestive but not definitive. The legal reality: the state had built a powerful narrative, but narrative alone does not meet legal standards. The defense had introduced alternatives: drowning, family dysfunction, poor investigative handling. The jurors did not have to believe the drowning theory completely. They only had to consider whether it could be possible. If possible, it created doubt, and doubt requires acquittal. The aftermath did not bring peace to the Anthony family. It did not erase public scrutiny. Casey Anthony's release was met with protests and intense media presence. she largely withdrew from public view in the years that followed. The case entered cultural memory as shorthand for controversial acquittal. It became a topic in legal classrooms, a case study in circumstantial evidence, in prosecutorial strategy, in jury psychology. Time moved forward, but the questions did not disappear. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, it feels different from cases that end in conviction. There is no sense of closure, no definitive explanation accepted by all sides, only competing interpretations. Did the state overreach in seeking first-degree murder without stronger forensic backing? Did investigators fail to secure clearer evidence early in the case? Or did the defense successfully leverage doubt where none should have existed? The answer depends on perspective, and perspective shapes memory. One undeniable fact remains: a 2-year-old child died. Her life ended without public clarity on how. The courtroom resolved the legal question. It did not resolve the emotional one. The Casey Anthony trial stands as a reminder of the distinction between suspicion and proof, between narrative and evidence, between what feels true and what can be established beyond reasonable doubt. If you had been seated in that jury box, instructed to follow only the law, ignoring headlines, ignoring commentary, focusing solely on admissible evidence, would your conclusion have matched the verdict? Or would you have weighed the circumstantial web differently? That tension is why this case continues to surface in discussion. Not because it lacks documentation, but because it forces reflection on how justice operates under strict standards. As the night continues, the story does not end in resolution. It ends in contrast. Public certainty, legal uncertainty, and a verdict that still sparks debate years later. Thank you for listening.